World War I. One bullet in Sarajevo didn't start a war. It ignited a world already soaked in gunpowder. Europe looked powerful in 1914, but beneath the gold, everything was ready to explode. Trenches weren't battlefields. They were graves waiting for soldiers. This wasn't bravery versus bravery. It was flesh versus machines. World War I wasn't European. Empires dragged the whole planet into blood. 1917 changed everything. One empire collapsed, another superpower arrived. The war ended at 11 a.m., but men were still dying after peace was signed. Versailles promised peace. What it delivered was World War II.
The Spark and the Powder Keg. Origins of World War I. The Golden Facade. In the summer of 1914, Europe was at the absolute height of its power. To an outside observer, it seemed like a golden age. Kings, emperors, and sultans ruled over vast territories that stretched across the globe. Culture, art, and technology were booming like never before. Cities like Paris, Vienna, and Berlin were the centers of the modern world. But beneath this shining surface, a dark and deadly machine was ticking. Europe wasn't a family of friendly nations. It was a room filled with gunpowder, waiting for a single spark. It wasn't just one bullet that caused the Great War. It was a lethal cocktail of bruised egos, secret societies, and a military timeline that, once started, could not be stopped. How did a sandwich, a wrong turn, and a teenage student end the world order forever? To understand that, we have to go back to where the trouble began. The sick man and the vacuum. To understand the spark, we must first look at the Balkans, a region often called the powder keg of Europe. For centuries, the mighty Ottoman Empire had ruled this region with an iron fist. But by the early 20th century, the Ottoman Empire was crumbling, known around the world as the sick man of Europe. As the Ottomans lost control, new, hungry nations like Serbia rose up to fill the vacuum. Serbia dreamed of a greater Serbia, a united country for all Slavic people in the Balkans. But there was a massive obstacle in their way, the Austro-Hungarian Empire. In 1908, Austria had annexed Bosnia, a land full of ethnic Serbs. This act made Austria the arch-enemy of Serbian nationalists. On the other side, Russia saw itself as the big brother and protector of all Slavs. So you had a tiny nation backed by a giant, Russia, staring down an aging empire, Austria. The stage was perfectly set for a disaster. The Black Hand, terror in the shadows. Enter Gavrilo Princip. He wasn't just an angry student acting alone. He was a recruit of the Black Hand, a secret military society operating deep within the Serbian army. Their motto was chillingly simple: unification or death. The Black Hand was ruthless. They recruited young, radicalized students who were willing to die for the cause. They provided the pistols, the bombs, and even cyanide pills for the assassins to take if they were caught. Their goal was terror, to assassinate a high-profile Austrian target and break Austria's grip on the Balkans. They didn't realize that their plan would do far more than just free Bosnia. It was about to break the entire world. The Assassination, a comedy of errors. On June 28, 1914, Archduke Franz Ferdinand, the heir to the Austrian throne, visited Sarajevo. It was a day that should have gone smoothly, but instead it turned into a comedy of errors. Early in the morning, one of the Black Hand conspirators threw a bomb at the Archduke's car, but he forgot the bomb had a 10-second delay. It bounced off the roof of the car and exploded under the car behind them, injuring officers, but leaving the Archduke unharmed. The assassin swallowed his cyanide pill and jumped into the river to escape, but the cyanide was expired. It only made him vomit, and the river was only inches deep. He was caught immediately. At this point, the assassination attempt was a failure. The Archduke was safe. He should have left the city immediately. Instead, in a fateful decision, he decided to visit the injured officers in the hospital to show his support. But no one told his driver about the change in plans. The driver followed the original route and took a wrong turn down a narrow street. When the mistake was realized, the driver slammed on the brakes to reverse, but the car's gears jammed. The open-top car stalled exactly 5 feet away from where Gavrilo Princip was standing, dejected and thinking the mission had failed. Fate had intervened in the most cruel way possible. Princip stepped forward, raised his pistol, and fired 2 shots. One hit the Archduke, the other hit his wife, Sophie. The spark had been struck. The blank check, the diplomatic fatal flaw. In any other era, this might have remained a local tragedy, a conflict between Austria and Serbia, but the political machinery of Europe ensured it would not stop there. Austria was furious and wanted to crush Serbia once and for all, but they were terrified of Serbia's protector, Russia. Before making a move, Austria asked their most powerful ally, Germany, for advice. This is where history turned. Germany gave Austria what historians call the blank check. Germany promised unconditional support, effectively telling Austria, "Do whatever you want, we will back you up, even if it means war with Russia." Germany took a massive gamble. They believed Russia was not ready for war and would back down. It was a miscalculation that would cost millions of lives. The Schlieffen Plan, war by timeline. But why did the war spread so fast across the entire continent? The answer lies in a secret German military strategy known as the Schlieffen Plan. Germany faced a geographical nightmare. They had enemies on both sides, France in the west and Russia in the east. They knew they couldn't fight both at the same time. Their only hope was speed. The plan was brutal and precise. Knock out France in just 6 weeks while the massive but slow Russian army was still trying to mobilize. Then rush all troops to the east to fight Russia. This plan created a deadly trap. The moment Russia started moving its trains to help Serbia, Germany had to attack France immediately to stick to their schedule. Diplomacy died because the military timetables took over. Once the trains started moving and the mobilization orders were signed, no politician, king, or Kaiser could stop them. The illusion, over by Christmas. Perhaps the greatest tragedy of 1914 was the mood of the people. In August, as war was declared, panic didn't sweep through Europe, excitement did. Crowds in Berlin, London, and Paris cheered in the streets. Young men rushed to recruitment offices, lying about their age just to enlist. They thought war would be a glorious adventure, a dash of cavalry charges, heroic battles, and medals. The common phrase on everyone's lips was, "Don't worry, it will be over by Christmas." They were tragically naive. They had no idea that the 19th century tactics they learned in school were about to collide with 20th century industrial technology. The age of cavalry was over. The age of slaughter was about to begin. The machine guns were waiting. But the soldiers marching to the front lines had no idea of the horror that awaited them. The war was not going to be a short adventure. It was going to be a long, muddy descent into hell.
The Clash of Titans, Allied versus Central Powers. The board is set. By August 1914, the diplomatic chaos we saw in the last episode had hardened into a brutal reality. The talking was over. The shooting had begun. The map of the world was no longer defined by borders, but by 2 colors, the Allied powers and the Central Powers. But this wasn't just a fight between countries. It was a clash between dying empires and rising industrial giants. To understand why this war dragged on for 4 bloody years, we must look closely at who was holding the guns. Who were these titans? What were their strengths? And what fatal weaknesses were they hiding? The Central Powers, the fortress in the middle. Geographically, they were a solid block in the heart of Europe, Germany and Austria-Hungary. Germany was the muscle of this alliance. They had the best-trained army in the world, the finest industrial factories, and a terrifying new fleet of submarines called U-boats. But Germany was haunted by a strategic nightmare, encirclement. They were trapped, with enemies on both the west, France, and the east, Russia. Germany felt like a cornered wolf. Their only strategy was aggression, to strike out hard and fast before they were squeezed to death. Then there was their partner, Austria-Hungary. On maps, it looked like a massive, powerful empire. In reality, it was a crumbling relic. It was a patchwork of over 10 different ethnic groups, Hungarians, Czechs, Slovaks, and Serbs, many of whom hated their Austrian rulers. Their army was a logistical disaster. Officers often spoke German, while their soldiers spoke 10 different languages. Orders were misunderstood in the heat of battle. Germany famously described being allied to Austria as being shackled to a corpse. Yet this corpse was determined to drag everyone down with it. The wild card, the Ottoman Empire. Later in 1914, a new player joined the Central Powers, changing the war's scope entirely. The Ottoman Empire, modern-day Turkey. Why did they join? Fear. The Ottomans were terrified of their ancient enemy, Russia, who coveted the city of Istanbul. Seeing Germany's military might, the Ottoman leaders made a secret gamble. They bombed Russian ports in the Black Sea, officially entering the war. This was catastrophic for the Allies. The Ottomans controlled the Dardanelles Strait, the only warm water passage to Russia. By closing this, they choked Russia's supply lines. Furthermore, the Sultan declared a holy war, or jihad, against the Allies, hoping to incite Muslims in the British and French colonies to rebel. The war had now spilled from the mud of Europe to the sands of the Middle East. The Allied powers, the Ring of Iron. Facing them was the Allied powers, or the Triple Entente. France was the heart of the resistance. For 40 years they had nursed a grudge against Germany for taking the provinces of Alsace-Lorraine. The French army was driven by a dangerous philosophy called élan vital, the belief that pure fighting spirit could defeat bullets. In the early months, French soldiers marched into battle wearing bright red trousers and blue coats, making them perfect targets for German machine gunners. They would learn the hard way that spirit cannot stop steel. To the east lay the Russian Empire. Russia was known as the steamroller. It had the largest army in the world, millions of men. The Allies hoped Russia would simply roll over Germany by sheer numbers. But Russia was a giant with clay feet. It was unindustrialized, poor, and led by the incompetent Tsar Nicholas II. Many Russian soldiers were sent to the front without rifles, told to pick up weapons from their dead comrades. And finally, Great Britain. Britain brought something Germany could not match, the Royal Navy and the wealth of a global empire. Britain didn't just send English soldiers, they brought Indians, Canadians, Australians, and Africans. They set up a naval blockade in the North Sea, slowly starving Germany of food and supplies. It was a strategy of suffocation. The betrayal. Italy switches sides. There was one major European power missing from the fight in 1914, Italy. On paper, Italy was part of the Triple Alliance with Germany and Austria-Hungary, but when the war started, Italy stayed silent. The Italians looked at the map and realized that the land they wanted, Trieste and Tyrol, was held by their own ally, Austria. In 1915, in a secret deal known as the Treaty of London, Britain and France made Italy an offer. Join us and we will give you Austrian land. Italy accepted. They betrayed their old alliance and opened a new front in the Alps. This forced Austria to fight a war in the freezing mountains, further weakening the Central Powers. Outro. The stalemate begins. So the stage was set. The Central Powers had the speed and the internal lines of communication. The Allies had the manpower and the resources of the world. Everyone expected a quick knockout blow. But as the armies clashed, something unexpected happened. The new weapons, machine guns and heavy artillery, were so deadly that neither side could advance. To survive, the soldiers stopped moving and started digging. The war of movement was dead. The age of the trenches was born.
The industrial slaughter, trench warfare and technology. The death of the old world. By the winter of 1914, the war that everyone said would be over by Christmas had ground to a bloody halt. The romantic image of war, of gallant cavalry charges, colorful uniforms, and honorable duels died in the mud of Flanders. In its place, a new terrifying reality emerged. To survive the storm of steel raining down from modern artillery, millions of men did the only thing they could. They dug into the earth. From the Swiss border to the North Sea, a scar was carved across the face of Europe, a continuous line of ditches stretching over 400 miles. The anatomy of a trench, a labyrinth of mud. First, let's look at the trench itself. It wasn't just a simple hole in the ground. It was a complex, sophisticated labyrinth. There were 3 lines. The front line was for firing at the enemy. Behind that was the support line, and further back, the reserve line. Connecting them were communication trenches used to move food, ammunition, and wounded men. Life inside these walls of dirt was a daily struggle for survival against the elements. The trenches were often flooded with freezing water. Soldiers had to stand in this sludge for days, sometimes weeks, without removing their boots. This led to a horrific medical condition known as trench foot. The feet would swell, go numb, and then start to rot and turn black. If not treated immediately, the toes or even the entire foot had to be amputated. And they were never alone. The trenches were infested with millions of rats. These weren't normal rats. Fed on the corpses left in no man's land, they grew to the size of cats. Soldiers would wake up to find rats crawling over their faces, stealing food from their pockets. Then there were the lice, tiny parasites that lived in the seams of uniforms, causing an incessant, maddening itch that drove men to the brink of insanity. The routine of death, stand to, and the wait. Warfare wasn't constant fighting. It was mostly hours of terrifying boredom interrupted by moments of sheer terror. The day began before dawn with stand to. Every soldier stood on the fire step with his rifle ready, waiting for an enemy attack that usually came with the rising sun. If no attack came, the rest of the day was spent repairing sandbags, cleaning rifles, and trying to sleep in cramped dugouts while artillery shells exploded overhead. The psychological toll was devastating. The constant noise of heavy artillery, drums of thunder that could be heard in London miles away, shattered the human nervous system. Doctors called it shell shock. Strong men would be reduced to trembling wrecks, staring blankly into space, unable to speak or walk. It was the mind's way of shutting down to escape the horror. No man's land and the machine gun. Separating the two armies was a desolate strip of land known as no man's land.
It was a landscape from a nightmare. Churned-up mud, deep craters filled with poisonous water, and the shattered remains of trees and buildings. But the biggest obstacle was the barbed wire, miles of it, tangled and thick, designed to trap soldiers like flies in a web. And watching over this wasteland was the undisputed king of the battlefield, the machine gun. The German MG-08 and the British Vickers gun changed warfare forever. A single machine gun could fire 600 rounds per minute, the equivalent firepower of 100 riflemen. When generals blew the whistle and ordered thousands of men to climb over the top and charge, they were sending them into a wall of lead. At the Battle of the Somme in 1916, the British Army lost nearly 20,000 men in a single day, most of them cut down by machine guns before they even reached the enemy wire. The old tactics of courage and charging were useless against industrial efficiency. Chemical warfare, the invisible killer. Desperate to break this stalemate, the German army turned to science. On April 22, 1915, at the Second Battle of Ypres, Allied soldiers noticed a strange greenish-yellow cloud drifting toward them with the wind. They thought it was a smokescreen to hide an attack. They were wrong. It was chlorine gas. As the cloud enveloped the trenches, soldiers began to choke. The gas reacted with the water in their lungs to form hydrochloric acid, essentially drowning them from the inside out. Panic spread instantly. But the horror didn't stop there. Later came phosgene, which was invisible and deadlier, and finally, the infamous mustard gas. Mustard gas didn't just attack the lungs, it blistered the skin and blinded the eyes. It remained in the soil for weeks, making the mud itself poisonous. Soldiers had to adapt quickly. Early protection was primitive. Men were told to urinate on a cloth and hold it over their faces, as the ammonia in urine neutralized the chlorine. Eventually, gas masks were developed, giving soldiers the terrifying insect-like appearance that became the haunting symbol of the war. The tank, the iron monster. The Allies realized that human bodies could not break the machine gun lines. They needed armor. The solution came from the British Navy, developed in total secrecy under the name land ships. To confuse enemy spies, they were labeled as water tanks on shipping crates. The name stuck, and they became simply tanks. The first tanks, like the British Mark I, were clumsy giants. Inside, they were a hellscape, deafeningly loud, filled with engine fumes, and reaching temperatures of 50 degrees Celsius. They were slow, moving at walking speed, and often broke down or got stuck in the mud. But when they first appeared at the Battle of the Somme, the psychological impact was massive. German soldiers, who had never seen such a thing, fled in terror as these iron monsters crushed barbed wire and rolled over trenches. The tank didn't win the war overnight, but it signaled the end of the trench stalemate and the beginning of modern mechanized warfare. The war at sea, the U-boat threat. While the land war was stuck in the mud, a silent and deadly war was being fought beneath the waves. Germany, knowing it could not match the surface power of the British Royal Navy, unleashed a new weapon, the Unterseeboot, or U-boat. Germany declared the waters around Britain a war zone. Their goal was to starve Britain into submission by sinking merchant ships carrying food and supplies. The U-boat was an invisible predator, striking without warning with torpedoes. This strategy was effective, but dangerous. In 1915, a German U-boat sank the passenger liner RMS Lusitania, killing 1,198 civilians, including 128 Americans. This act outraged the world and turned public opinion in the United States firmly against Germany. The U-boat was a powerful weapon, but it was also a ticking bomb that would eventually drag a new superpower into the war. The Air War, the Knights of the Sky. Finally, we must look up. For the first time in history, war took to the skies. At the start of the war, airplanes were flimsy structures of wood and canvas, used only for reconnaissance, spying on enemy trench lines. Pilots would even wave to each other. But soon the sky became a battlefield. Pilots started carrying pistols, then bricks, and finally machine guns were synchronized to fire through the spinning propeller blades. This gave birth to the dogfight. The pilots became the new celebrities of the war, modern-day knights riding flying horses. The most famous of them all was the German ace Manfred von Richthofen, known as the Red Baron, who shot down 80 enemy planes. But the life expectancy of a new pilot in 1917 was measured in weeks. The sky offered no trenches to hide in. There was only victory or death. By 1916, technology had transformed Europe into a slaughterhouse. The machine gun, the tank, the submarine, and poison gas had industrialized death on a scale never seen before. The war was no longer about bravery, it was about attrition. Who could endure the suffering the longest? But while the soldiers suffered in the mud, the war was spreading like a cancer. It was no longer contained to Europe. It was spilling over into the deserts of Arabia, the jungles of Africa, and the hot.
We will travel across the globe to see how this conflict set the entire world on fire.
A global conflict. The war beyond Europe. The illusion of boundaries. For the first few months of 1914, the world watched Europe with a mix of horror and fascination. Newspapers in New York, Bombay, and Tokyo called it the European War. The assumption was simple. The fighting would be contained within the borders of the great powers, France, Germany, Russia, and Austria. But this assumption ignored a fundamental truth. These were not just nations, they were empires. Britain and France controlled vast swaths of Africa and Asia. Germany held territories in the Pacific and Africa. The Ottoman Empire stretched across the Middle East. When the emperors went to war, their subjects went with them. By 1915, the conflict had metastasized like a virus. It crossed oceans and deserts, ignoring borders entirely. From the frozen peaks of the Caucasus Mountains to the steaming jungles of Tanzania, from the sands of Arabia to the shores of China, the world was on fire. In this episode, we leave the mud of the Western Front to witness how the Great War became the First World War. The Ottoman Gamble, the War for the Straits. The expansion of the war began with the sick man of Europe, the Ottoman Empire. Joining the Central Powers was a desperate gamble to save their crumbling empire, but it immediately threatened the Allies' most critical lifeline. The Ottomans controlled the Dardanelles Strait, a narrow waterway connecting the Mediterranean to the Black Sea. This was the only warm water route for Britain and France to send supplies to their struggling ally, Russia. When the Ottomans closed this strait, Russia was effectively suffocated. The disaster at Gallipoli. Winston Churchill, then the head of the British Navy, proposed a bold solution: use the massive British fleet to force through the straits, capture the Ottoman capital of Constantinople, i.e. Istanbul, and knock Turkey out of the war. It was supposed to be easy. It was a catastrophe. Ottoman mines sank British battleships, forcing a land invasion. On April 25, 1915, Allied troops, primarily the Australian and New Zealand Army Corps, known as the Anzacs, stormed the beaches of the Gallipoli Peninsula. They expected to fight a disorganized enemy. Instead, they ran into a wall of fire commanded by a brilliant Ottoman officer named Mustafa Kemal, who would later become Ataturk. The Allies were pinned down on narrow strips of beach, with steep cliffs ahead of them and the sea behind them. For 8 months, they lived in a hell of heat, flies, and dysentery. The dead could not be buried, and the stench was overpowering. It became a trench stalemate, just like in France, but under a scorching sun. In January 1916, the Allies retreated in humiliation. Over 500,000 men from both sides were killed or wounded. For the Allies, it was a defeat. For the Turks, it was a supreme moment of national defense. The Frozen Hell, the Caucasus Campaign. While the British fought on the beaches, the Russians were fighting the Ottomans in the mountains. This was the Caucasus Campaign, often forgotten by history books, but it was one of the most brutal theaters of the war. The Ottoman war minister, Enver Pasha, dreamed of expanding his empire into Central Asia. In the dead of winter, December 1914, he ordered 90,000 Turkish soldiers to attack Russian positions at Sarajevo. It was a suicide mission commanded by arrogance. The soldiers were not equipped for winter. Many wore summer uniforms and had no winter boots. They didn't just fight the Russians, they fought temperatures of -30 degrees Celsius. Tens of thousands of Ottoman soldiers froze to death in their sleep, their bodies turning into statues in the snow. Enver Pasha lost 80% of his army, not to bullets, but to the cold. The crime against humanity, the Armenian genocide. The failure at Sarajevo led to one of the darkest chapters of the 20th century. Looking for a scapegoat for his military incompetence, Enver Pasha and the Ottoman government blamed the Armenian people, an Istan's Christian minority within the empire. They accused the Armenians of siding with the Russians. What followed was a systematic campaign of extermination. Starting in 1915, Armenian intellectuals were arrested and executed. Then the general population, men, women, and children, were forced on death marches into the Syrian desert without food or water. Those who stopped walking were shot. Others died of starvation or disease. Historians estimate that between 600,000 and 1.5 million Armenians perished. While the world was distracted by the war, an ancient culture was nearly wiped off the map, setting a terrifying precedent for future genocides.
The Middle East: Lawrence, Lies, and Betrayal. Further south, in the deserts of Arabia, the British decided to fight the Ottomans from the inside. They identified a weakness. The Ottoman Empire ruled over millions of Arabs who wanted independence. British intelligence sent a young, eccentric archaeologist named T.E. Lawrence, later known as Lawrence of Arabia, to meet with Arab leaders. Lawrence wasn't a typical soldier. He dressed in Arab robes, learned their language, and gained the trust of Prince Faisal. He convinced the Arabs to revolt against their Turkish masters, promising them a unified, independent Arab nation after the war. The Guerrilla War. The Arab revolt was a masterpiece of asymmetry. The Bedouin warriors couldn't fight in trenches, so they didn't. They rode camels across the impassable Nefud Desert to strike Ottoman railway lines, the Hijaz Railway. They blew up trains, cut telegraph wires, and vanished into the sands before the Turks could react. In a stunning victory, they captured the strategic port of Aqaba by attacking from the landward side, where the Turkish guns couldn't turn around. The Sykes-Picot betrayal. But while Lawrence was fighting alongside the Arabs, believing in their cause, his government was betraying them. In 1916, two diplomats, Mark Sykes of Britain and François-Georges Picot of France, sat down in secret with a map and a ruler.
They drew a straight line across the Middle East. The Sykes-Picot Agreement decided that after the war, France would take Syria and Lebanon, while Britain would take Iraq, Palestine, and Jordan. The promise of Arab independence was a lie. When the Arabs eventually liberated Damascus in 1918, they found that they had only exchanged one imperial master for another. This betrayal planted the seeds of conflict that still plague the Middle East today. The war in Africa, the Phantom General. The war also came to the African continent. Germany had 4 main colonies in Africa: Togo, Cameroon, Namibia, and German East Africa, Tanzania. The British and French expected to seize these quickly. In most places, they did. But in East Africa, they met a military genius, General Paul von Lettow-Vorbeck. Lettow-Vorbeck knew he couldn't win. He was cut off from Germany with no way to get supplies. His goal was different: chaos. He wanted to tie up as many Allied soldiers as possible in Africa, so they couldn't fight in Europe. He commanded a small force of about 14,000 men, mostly loyal African soldiers known as askaris. For 4 years, he led 300,000 British, Belgian, and Indian troops on a wild goose chase across jungles, swamps, and mountains. He lived off the land, capturing British supplies to feed his men. He was the only German commander to remain undefeated when the war ended in 1918. The human cost, the carrier corps. But the romance of this guerrilla war hides a grim reality. Neither army had trucks that could handle the jungle. They needed humans to carry supplies. The British forced over 1 million local Africans into the carrier corps. These porters carried ammunition and food on their backs for hundreds of miles. They were treated worse than beasts of burden. They died like flies from malaria, dysentery, starvation, and exhaustion. It is estimated that over 100,000 African carriers died to support a war that had nothing to do with them. Their names do not appear on the war memorials. The war in Asia, the rise of Japan. Even the Far East was not spared. Japan, an ally of Britain, saw the war as a golden opportunity to expand its own empire in China and the Pacific. In 1914, Japanese forces besieged the German port city of Qingdao in China. It was a modern siege, featuring the first ever use of aircraft launched from a ship to attack land targets. Germany was quickly defeated in Asia. Japan seized German islands in the Pacific, islands like the Marshalls and Carolines, which they would later use against the Americans in World War II. The First World War essentially cleared the path for Japan to become the dominant power in Asia. The colonial sacrifice, the world in the trenches. Finally, we must acknowledge the global face of the trenches in Europe. When Britain and France ran out of young men, they turned to their colonies. Over 1.3 million Indian soldiers served the British Empire. They arrived in France in 1914, still wearing tropical uniforms in the freezing winter. Without the Indian Corps at the Battle of Neuve-Chapelle, the British line might have broken. France brought hundreds of thousands of Senegalese, Algerian, and Moroccan soldiers. They also brought nearly 140,000 Chinese laborers to dig trenches and bury the dead. These men saw the civilized white nations butchering each other with a savagery that shattered the myth of European superiority. When these soldiers returned home to India, Africa, and Asia, they went back with a new spirit of nationalism. They had bled for the empire. Now they wanted their freedom. By 1917, the fire sparked in Sarajevo had burned its way across the entire globe. Millions of people, from the Bedouins of Arabia to the villagers of Tanzania, had been swept up in the madness. The war was at a stalemate. The armies were exhausted. The populations were starving. Something had to break, and in 1917 it finally did. Two massive events would shift the balance of the war and the history of the 20th century: the collapse of the Russian giant and the entry of a new superpower from across the Atlantic.
The turning point, 1917. America enters, Russia exits. The year of agony. By 1917, the Great War had been raging for 3 years. The initial excitement was a distant memory, buried under the mud of the Somme and the bones of Verdun. Europe was bleeding to death. The stalemate seemed unbreakable. Millions had died, yet the trench lines had barely moved. But behind the front lines, the strain was becoming unbearable. Civilians were starving, economies were collapsing, soldiers were beginning to mutiny. 1917 would be the year that broke the deadlock. It was the year of the Great Shift. One giant would fall, consumed by its own internal fire, and a new giant would rise from across the ocean to take its place. This is the story of how a German train ride and a Mexican telegram changed the course of human history. The collapse of the giant. Russia on the brink. We begin in the East with the Russian Empire. Russia had entered the war with the largest army in the world, the so-called steamroller. But by 1917, the steamroller had run out of fuel. The war had exposed the deep rot inside the Russian system. The Russian army was poorly led and ill-equipped. Soldiers were often sent into battle without rifles, told to wait until a comrade died to pick up his weapon. Over 2 million Russian soldiers were dead. But the real collapse happened at home. The Tsar, Nicholas II, made a fatal mistake. He took personal command of the army at the front. This meant that every defeat was now blamed personally on him. Worse, he left the capital, Petrograd, in the hands of his wife, the Empress Alexandra, and her mysterious, controversial advisor, the Siberian mystic Grigory Rasputin. Rumors of corruption and incompetence spread like wildfire, but the immediate trigger was simpler: bread. The war had shattered Russia's railway system. Food was rotting in the fields because it couldn't be transported to the cities. In the freezing winter of 1917, the women of Petrograd took to the streets, screaming for bread. The soldiers, ordered to shoot the protesters, refused. Instead, they turned their guns on their officers. The Tsar was forced to abdicate. The 300-year reign of the Romanov dynasty ended in a matter of days. The weapon in a sealed train. Lenin. A provisional government took over Russia, promising democracy. But they made one catastrophic error. They decided to stay in the war to honor their alliance with Britain and France. The Russian people, desperate for peace, were furious. Germany saw an opportunity. They knew Russia was teetering on the edge. They decided to use a secret weapon, not a gun, but a man. Living in exile in Switzerland was a radical communist revolutionary named Vladimir Lenin. Lenin wanted to destroy the Russian government and pull Russia out of the war. The German High Command made a cynical calculation. They put Lenin and his associates on a sealed train, a train that was locked so they couldn't get off in Germany, and transported them across Europe to Russia. Churchill later described this as transporting a plague bacillus into Russia. The plan worked perfectly. Lenin arrived in Petrograd in April 1917, chanting peace, land, and bread. By October, his Bolshevik party had seized power in a second revolution. Russia now was the Soviet Union, and their first act was to surrender. The Treaty of Brest-Litovsk, a bitter peace. The exit of Russia was formalized in the Treaty of Brest-Litovsk in early 1918. It was a humiliation.
Russia lost 34% of its population, 54% of its industrial land, and 89% of its coal fields to Germany. For the Allies, Britain and France, this was a nightmare. The Eastern Front was closed. Millions of German soldiers, previously tied up fighting Russians, were now free. They packed onto trains and headed west. Germany now had a brief window of opportunity to crush France before they ran out of supplies. But they had a new problem. A new enemy was crossing the Atlantic. The Sleeping Giant. Why America Stayed Out. For 3 years, the United States of America had stayed neutral. President Woodrow Wilson had won re-election in 1916 on the slogan, "He kept us out of war." America was a melting pot of immigrants, German Americans, Irish Americans who hated Britain, and British Americans. Choosing a side risked civil unrest at home. Plus, neutrality was profitable. American factories were getting rich selling ammunition and supplies to the Allies. But Germany was about to force their hand. By 1917, the British naval blockade was strangling Germany. The Germans were starving. They were eating turnip bread to survive. The German High Command decided they had to break the British blockade at any cost.
The Gamble. Unrestricted submarine warfare. On February 1, 1917, Germany resumed unrestricted submarine warfare. They announced that their U-boats would sink any ship approaching Britain, including American merchant ships. The German generals knew this would drag the United States into the war, but they calculated the math. They believed it would take America at least a year to build an army and ship it to Europe. They gambled that their U-boats could starve Britain into surrender before the Americans arrived. It was a race against time. The spy thriller, the Zimmermann telegram. If the U-boats were the spark, the Zimmermann telegram was the explosion. In January 1917, British intelligence intercepted a coded message sent by the German Foreign Minister Arthur Zimmermann to the Mexican government. The codebreakers in Room 40 in London couldn't believe what they were reading. The telegram proposed a military alliance between Germany and Mexico. It stated that if the U.S. entered the war, Mexico should attack the U.S. southern border. In return, Germany promised to help Mexico reconquer its lost territories, Texas, New Mexico, and Arizona. It sounds insane today, but Germany hoped this would keep the American army busy at home, protecting their own borders, instead of coming to Europe. The British waited for the perfect moment to reveal this to the Americans. When the telegram was published in U.S. newspapers, public opinion exploded. It wasn't just a European war anymore. Germany was threatening American soil. The world must be made safe for democracy. On April 2, 1917, President Wilson stood before Congress. He declared that neutrality was no longer possible. He framed the war not as a battle for territory, but as a crusade for freedom. He famously said, "The world must be made safe for democracy." 4 days later, the United States declared war on Germany. But declaring war and fighting it were two different things. America had a tiny standing army, smaller than Portugal's. They had no tanks and few planes. They needed months to draft, train, and transport millions of men. Germany watched the clock. They had moved their armies from Russia to France. They had one last chance. They had to strike a knockout blow on the Western Front before the sheer weight of American manpower and industrial might arrived to crush them. 1917 ended in a terrifying suspense. The Russians were out, freeing up the entire German army. The Americans were in,
But they hadn't arrived yet. The balance of the war hung by a thread. The stage was set for 1918. It would be a race between German speed and American logistics. In the next episode, we will witness the endgame. We will cover the massive German spring offensive, the breaking of the Hindenburg Line, and the final collapse that led to the armistice. Please help us with your time.
The end of the fighting. The armistice. The race against time. As the sun rose in 1918, the German Empire faced a terrifying mathematical reality. The Russians were out of the war, which was good news, but the Americans were coming, and that was a death sentence. German General Erich Ludendorff knew he had only one window of opportunity. He had moved 500,000 soldiers from the Russian front to the west. For the first time in years, Germany had more men than the Allies. But at home, the German people were starving to death due to the British naval blockade. Ludendorff decided to roll the dice. He would launch one massive final attack to crush the British and French before the American army could fully arrive. It was an all-or-nothing gamble. If they won, Germany would rule Europe. If they failed, Germany was finished. The Stormtroopers, changing the art of war. On March 21, 1918, the silence of the morning was shattered by the loudest artillery barrage in history. Operation Michael had begun. But this time, the Germans didn't just walk in a line toward enemy machine guns. They introduced a new, terrifying tactic, the Stormtroopers, Stoßtruppen. Unlike regular infantry, stormtroopers were elite specialists. They carried light machine guns, flamethrowers, and bags of grenades. Their orders were to ignore strong points. If they hit a tough British bunker, they simply ran past it, leaving it for the regular army to deal with later. Their goal was to punch deep holes in the enemy line and cause chaos in the rear. The tactic worked. For the first time in 4 years, the stalemate was broken. The British and French lines crumbled. The Germans advanced 40 miles, a distance that was unthinkable just a year earlier. They got so close to Paris that they could shell the city with massive long-range guns. Panic swept through the Allied capitals. It looked like Germany was going to win. The failure, exhaustion, and Spanish flu. But the German advance had a fatal flaw. They were moving too fast. Their supply wagons, pulled by starving horses, couldn't keep up with the stormtroopers. When the starving German soldiers captured Allied trenches, they didn't keep fighting. Instead, they stopped looting. They found white bread, corned beef, and wine, luxuries they hadn't seen in years. The discipline of the German army broke down under the weight of their own hunger. Then, nature struck a deadly blow. The Spanish flu began to sweep through the trenches. It killed indiscriminately, but it hit the malnourished German army the hardest. Hundreds of thousands of soldiers fell sick. The offensive stalled. The gamble had failed. The 100 Days Offensive, the Black Day. By August 1918, the German army was exhausted, and just as they stopped, the hammer fell. The Allies launched their counterattack, the 100 Days Offensive. But this wasn't the old style of war. It was the birth of modern warfare. The Allies used combined arms, tanks, airplanes, artillery, and infantry, all working together in perfect coordination. At the Battle of Amiens on August 8th, Allied tanks smashed through the German lines. The German morale, which had held firm for 4 years, finally snapped. Soldiers began to surrender in droves. General Ludendorff called it the Black Day of the German Army. He told the Kaiser that the war was lost. They had to seek peace. The dominoes fall. Collapse of the Central Powers. While the Western Front was collapsing, Germany's allies were falling apart one by one.
Bulgaria was the first to surrender in September, leaving the back door to Austria-Hungary open. The Ottoman Empire, crushed by the British in the Middle East, surrendered in October. Austria-Hungary, the empire that started the war, dissolved into chaos as its different ethnic groups declared independence. Germany stood alone, and at home, Germany was burning. Revolution from within, the Kiel Mutiny. The German government tried to negotiate, but the Allies demanded total surrender. In a final act of madness, the German Naval Command ordered the High Seas Fleet to sail out and fight the British Navy in a suicide mission. The sailors refused. They had suffered enough. On October 29th, at the port of Kiel, the sailors mutinied. They arrested their officers and raised the red flag of revolution. The mutiny spread like wildfire to the cities. Workers went on strike. Germany was on the brink of a communist revolution, just like Russia. The Kaiser, Wilhelm II, the man who had led Germany into this catastrophe, realized his time was up. On November 9th, he abdicated the throne and fled into exile in the Netherlands. The 500-year-old Hohenzollern dynasty was gone. Germany was now a republic, and its only goal was to stop the killing. The train in the forest, signing the armistice. On a cold, foggy morning in November, a train arrived in a secret clearing in the forest of Compiègne, France. Inside was the Allied Supreme Commander Ferdinand Foch. A German delegation, led by a civilian politician named Matthias Erzberger, arrived to beg for peace. The atmosphere was icy. There were no handshakes. Foch didn't negotiate, he dictated. The terms were harsh. Germany had to give up all its heavy weapons, surrender its navy, and withdraw from all occupied territory. They had 72 hours to sign. Matthias Erzberger pleaded for mercy, citing the starving German population. Foch simply replied, "You are suffering from a disease you inflicted upon yourselves." With no other choice, Erzberger signed the armistice at 5 a.m. on November 11, 1918. The order was sent out. The war would end at the 11th hour of the 11th day of the 11th month. The tragic final 6 hours. Here lies the greatest tragedy of the final day. The armistice was signed at 5 a.m., but it wouldn't take effect until 11 a.m. That meant there were 6 hours left. Reasonable commanders stopped fighting, but some generals, driven by ego or a desire for promotion, ordered their men to attack until the last minute. At 10:59 a.m., 1 minute before peace, an American soldier named Henry Gunther charged a German machine gun nest. The Germans, knowing the war was about to end, waved at him to go back. Gunther kept running and firing. Reluctantly, the Germans shot him. He died at 10:59 a.m., the last official death of World War I. In those final 6 hours, over 3,000 men were killed, more than on D-Day in World War II. They died for absolutely nothing, with the peace treaty already in their commanders' pockets. The sound of silence. Then the clock struck 11. Suddenly, the guns stopped. Men who had lived with the roar of artillery for 4 years described the silence as painful and eerie. They didn't cheer, they didn't dance, they simply climbed out of their trenches, stared at their former enemies, and realized they had survived. The fighting was over. The war to end all wars was finished. But as the smoke cleared, the world realized the cost. 4 empires had collapsed. 9 million soldiers were dead. Maps were redrawn. And in the railway carriage in France, the seeds of an even greater conflict had just been planted. The Germans felt humiliated, not defeated. They believed they had been stabbed in the back by traitors at home. This bitterness would grow in the heart of a young corporal recovering from a gas attack, a corporal named Adolf Hitler. The guns were silent, but the war wasn't officially over. The peace had to be written. The victors gathered in Paris to decide the fate of the world. They intended to create a lasting peace. Instead, they created the blueprint for a second, deadlier war.
The aftermath and legacy, the Treaty of Versailles, the Hall of Mirrors. On June 28, 1919, the eyes of the world turned to the Palace of Versailles, just outside Paris. Specifically, to the Hall of Mirrors. The location was not chosen by accident. It was a calculated act of revenge. 48 years earlier, after defeating France in a previous war, the German Empire had been proclaimed in this very room. Now, the French dragged the Germans back to the same spot to witness the death of their empire. The guns had been silent for 6 months, but the war was not over. The battle had simply moved from the trenches to the negotiating table. The world waited for a just peace. Instead, what happened inside that glittering hall would redraw the map of the world, destroy 4 great empires, and plant the seeds of a second, deadlier conflict. This is the story of how the war to end all wars simply became the opening chapter of the war that never ended. The Big Three, a clash of motives. To understand the disaster of the treaty, we must meet the men who wrote it. Germany was not invited to the negotiations. They were treated as criminals awaiting sentencing. The fate of the world lay in the hands of the Big Three victors. First, there was Georges Clemenceau of France, known as the Tiger. He was an old man who had seen Germany invade his country twice in his lifetime. France had lost 1.4 million men. Huge parts of the country were reduced to rubble. Clemenceau didn't want peace. He wanted revenge. He wanted to crush Germany so completely that it could never threaten France again. Second, there was David Lloyd George, the British Prime Minister. He was in a difficult position. The British public wanted to hang the Kaiser and make Germany pay. But Lloyd George was a pragmatist. He knew that if Germany was destroyed, it would cause economic chaos in Europe and might lead to a communist revolution. He wanted justice, but not destruction. Finally, there was the American president, Woodrow Wilson. He was the idealist. He arrived in Europe like a savior, carrying his famous 14 points. He spoke of self-determination, the right of nations to choose their own borders, and a League of Nations to prevent future wars. He wanted a peace without victory. But in the smoky rooms of Paris, Wilson's idealism was torn apart by European hatred. Clemenceau famously mocked him, saying, "God gave us the 10 Commandments and we broke them. Wilson gives us the 14 points. We shall see." The terms, the diktat. When the Germans were finally called into the room to sign the treaty, they were horrified. It wasn't a negotiation, it was a diktat, a dictated peace. Territorial losses. Germany was stripped of 13% of its territory and all of its overseas colonies. Alsace-Lorraine was returned to France. The rich coal fields of the Saar were given to France for 15 years. In the east, a massive chunk of land was given to the new nation of Poland, cutting Germany in two to create the Polish Corridor. This separated East Prussia from the rest of Germany, a wound that would fester for decades. Military restrictions. The proud German military was gutted. The army was limited to 100,000 men, barely enough to stop a riot. They were forbidden from having tanks, an air force, or submarines. The Rhineland, the border with France, was demilitarized, meaning no German soldier could set foot there. Article 231, the War Guilt Clause. But the hardest blow was psychological. Article 231 forced Germany to accept total responsibility for causing the war. This was crucial
because if Germany was guilty, they could be made to pay. Reparations. The Allies presented a bill of 132 billion gold marks, roughly $500 billion today. It was a sum so astronomical that economists like John Maynard Keynes warned it would destroy the European economy. It would take Germany 92 years to pay it off. The final payment was made in 2010. The fall of empires and the new map. While Germany was being punished, the other Central Powers were being erased from history. The end of Austria-Hungary. The massive Habsburg Empire, which had ruled Central Europe for centuries, exploded. It was carved up into new small nations: Austria, Hungary, Czechoslovakia, and Yugoslavia. Overnight, millions of people found themselves living in new countries where they didn't speak the language or fit in. Austria was reduced to a tiny, weak state and forbidden from ever uniting with Germany. Anschluss. The end of the Ottoman Empire. The Ottoman Empire was dismantled completely. The British and French, ignoring their promises to the Arabs, divided the Middle East between them. Britain took Iraq and Palestine. France took Syria and Lebanon. These borders were drawn with a ruler, ignoring tribal and religious lines, creating the conflicts we still see in the Middle East today.
The resurrection of Poland. Out of the ashes of Russia, Germany, and Austria, the nation of Poland was reborn after 123 years of being wiped off the map. While this was a triumph for the Poles, it created bitter enemies on all sides who wanted their land back. The League of Nations, a toothless tiger. Woodrow Wilson did get his wish. The League of Nations was created. It was the first global organization designed to solve disputes through talking, not fighting. But it was doomed from the start. Why? Because the United States, the country that invented the idea, refused to join. The U.S. Senate, tired of European wars, voted against the treaty. Without American power, the League had no teeth. It couldn't stop aggression. It could only write angry letters. When dictators eventually rose, they would simply ignore it. The stab in the back legend. Back in Germany, the reaction to the treaty was not just anger, it was disbelief. Here is the most dangerous fact of 1918. The German army had not been destroyed on the battlefield. They were still in France when the war ended. They marched home in orderly columns, carrying their rifles. The German public had been told for years that they were winning. So, when the harsh terms of Versailles were revealed, the German people couldn't understand it. How did we lose? A conspiracy theory began to spread. Right-wing nationalists claimed that the army hadn't been defeated by the enemy. They had been betrayed at home by politicians, socialists, and Jews. This lie became known as the stab-in-the-back myth, Dolchstoßlegende. It was a lie, but it was a powerful one. It gave the German people a target for their anger. The mutilated victory, Italy and Japan. Resentment wasn't limited to the losers. Even the winners were angry. Italy had joined the Allies because they were promised land, but at Versailles, the Big Three ignored them. The Italians felt used and humiliated. They called it a mutilated victory. This anger would pave the way for a ruthless dictator named Benito Mussolini to seize power just 3 years later. Japan, too, was offended. They proposed a racial equality clause for the League of Nations, stating that all races were equal. The Western powers, particularly Australia and the U.S., rejected it. Insulted, Japan turned its back on the West and began a path of aggressive militarism that would lead to Pearl Harbor. The legacy, the lost generation. Beyond the politics, there was the human cost. The war left a generation broken. 9 million soldiers died. 21 million were wounded. In every town in France and Britain, you could see the gueules cassées, broken faces, men whose faces had been torn apart by shrapnel, hiding behind masks or staying in the shadows.
Then came the Spanish flu, brought home by returning soldiers, which killed another 50 million worldwide, more than the war itself. Art and literature changed. The optimism of the 19th century vanished. Writers like Hemingway and poets like Wilfred Owen described a world without meaning, without God, where good men died like dogs in the mud. The world had lost its innocence. The 20-year armistice. As the delegates left Versailles in 1919, they thought they had secured peace, but one man saw the truth. The French Supreme Commander, Ferdinand Foch, read the treaty and famously said, "This is not peace, it is an armistice for 20 years." He was chillingly accurate. The Treaty of Versailles didn't crush Germany enough to stop them, but it punished them enough to make them want revenge. It created a weak democracy in Germany, burdened by debt and hatred. In the shadows of this chaos, a forgotten Austrian corporal, recovering from a gas attack, wept when he heard the news of the surrender. He vowed to avenge the betrayal. He would take the anger, the humiliation, and the stab-in-the-back myth and forge them into a weapon. The First World War ended in 1918, but the struggle for the soul of the world had only just begun. The cannons were silent for now, but the fuse for World War II had already been lit. Thank you for joining us on this journey through the Great War. We have traveled from the assassination in Sarajevo to the Hall of Mirrors in Versailles. We hope this series has helped you understand not just what happened, but why our world looks the way it does today. If you enjoyed this deep dive into history, please subscribe and let us know in the comments, was the Treaty of Versailles a mistake? This has been Ancient History Stories. Story is history. History is never truly over. See you in the next video. Until then, stay well.